All right, good morning everyone. I'm here to talk about configuration validation and the efforts that's been leading us up to the point where we are today with this initiative, which is not really an initiative, and like where the next parts of it will lead us. So my name is Joris. I'm known on Drupal.org as Borison, which is also my nickname on Slack and other things. So to get the basics right, what is configuration? In Drupal, configuration is like everything that can configure a site, all the settings that define what differentiates your specific site from another site, which is content type, fields, taxonomy, vocabularies, search API configuration, paragraphs, all paragraph types, those kinds of different things, those are all configuration. Actually, this is how Drupal.org defines it itself. So validation, like let's get our basics right. This is an automatic check to ensure that data that's being entered somewhere is sensible and feasible, that the system knows how to handle the specific data. So why do we need the second thing, why do we need configuration to be validated? Well, actually, I was talking to Wim, who's been doing a lot of work on this, and he told me it all has one goal. When something is validated in detail, new possibilities emerge. So what possibilities, what new things can happen? Well, you could do regression detection in configuration, meaning before something gets imported with Drush config import, you could say, like, is this new validation that's coming, this new configuration that's coming in, is it correct for the configuration of this site? Is it something that's sensible for this site? Which is useful for automatic deployments, for automatic updates, for maybe recipes and project browser and automatically installing sites from a UI, those kind of things. So more reliability during the config import phase of your site, which also automatically gives you more reliability at the deployment part, because that's also a configuration import. More reliability in your configuration split, because if you do a config split on a specific property path, then that also has to be something that's valid. You could define something that's potentially invalid in code without any issues. This kind of validation should stop you from making your site break. It enables recipes, because recipes are just a bunch of config actions. Those config actions need to transform your configuration in something that's sensible. It allows you to do JSON API or REST or GraphQL or some kind of other HTTP standard for configuration, which in turn allows us to build a true decoupled admin, which I think is what Experience Builder is trying to be. Experience Builder cannot be a complete admin interface without it also being able to change the site name or what note the homepage is or any of the other things that we do with configuration. And as a stretch goal, something that I really find super interesting, and I know it's not going to happen within the next 5 years, but I think it's something really cool, is we could validate configuration strictly from outside of Drupal while still making sure that the configuration is something that is sensible for a Drupal site that's running that configuration. So what that means is, imagine you have a really fast Rust script or something written in Python that reads all the YAML files, checks that it's correct to your validation, and it can fail your deployment pipeline within 2 seconds before it actually does all the things of installing Composer install and all of those things. So you could have a very, very fast feedback that the configuration that you have is correct. But as I said, this is a stretch goal that will probably be quite far into the future. So to see where we are today, we have to start with some history, right? You will see maybe you won't see, but in the bottom right corner of the screen, there will always be a number, which is the version of Drupal in which the thing I'm talking about is released. This is version 1. This is the very first time I found something about variables within Drupal, which is 23 years ago when I took the screenshot. It's basically like when I teach developers at our company, like how you should write a commit message. This is the perfect example of how not to do it. Because this commit has, it fixed an update bug in book module. It provides a log message when adding and updating books. So maybe those things belong together, but all configurable variables are now accessible to variable get. That's not related to any of the other things there. So that's just like a bunch of things all crammed into one. It improved, it improved story.module, not improved, but improved. And it improved the robustness of sections.inc, which I don't know what it is, but I mean, this is the first mention of it. So now we skip a bunch of things and we go all the way to Drupal 8, where the file-based configuration was added. It replaced the entire variable get variable set thing that we used to have in prior versions of Drupal, as well as some weird one-off storage systems used for image styles, for example, which had its own variable get set like thing. And it's all now merged into one, and it allows that configuration to be imported and exported and staged between different versions of a site. It's what they used to call it, which basically means that you can write it to disk and load it from disk again. A bit later, they added a configuration metadata and schema system, which is basically what we're building on to build all of this. It was inspired by Qualify, written in a weird way with a KW for reasons that I don't know, but it's the format that we chose to define our configuration. And then still before Drupal 8 was released, there was these are all basically names of change records on Drupal.org. So if you want to know more about this, then you can Google this sentence and it will turn up. The only result will be something from Drupal.org. But before this was committed, everything was a string all the time when it was in the database. So you would serialize your configuration, Drupal would transform everything into a string, and then when it got back from the database, it would make it into an integer or a float or whatever it was supposed to be. There was no notion of data types or structure or whatsoever. So then we jump forward another 2 years to Drupal 8.4, and we introduce our very first piece of validation for configuration. And the first one we're going to do is UIDs. This is the only one I will get a bit more deeper into, and I will show a bit of code. The rest will be a little bit less technical, I guess. So we are changing the data type of this specific UUID from a string to UUID. I'm going to have to say UUID a couple of times in the next couple of slides. So this type is now defined as being extending from a string and having a label as a UUID, and a constraint which is the UUID constraint. This UUID constraint extends the UUID constraint that is provided by Symfony. So we're not writing anything ourselves. We're just going to say return this validator that already exists somewhere else, so we don't have to do anything. And then there's a UUID validator, which validates that the UUID constraint is actually a valid constraint that applies to this. The code in here actually does like, okay, it needs to have 4 characters at the beginning, then it needs to have a dash, then it needs to have another set of characters, then another dash, like the way a UUID looks. Before we had this in a UUID field in configuration, you could go into the YAML file, type in some kind of word, DrupalCamp or whatever, try to import it and break your entire site. And that worked. I don't know why you would do this, but it was an option. So this is the first validator that we added. We're skipping all the way to Drupal 9.1 now. So we were at 8.4. So that's another 2 to 3 years that we're skipping ahead. And this is the next thing that I could find about config schemas, which is we're going to allow them to be deprecated. And one got deprecated at pretty much the same time. we're skipping ahead another 2 years to Drupal 10.1, and we're finally getting somewhere. We're finally going to add new things to the constraint system, to the plugin system, to the schema system. So this one, it's a validation constraint to check that a plugin exists. So you have somewhere in your schema, you're calling for a plugin, for example, a search API processor. You're going to call search API.processor.prequery.html filter, for example. If that processor comes from a module that's not installed in the site, Drupal would happily import it and then say, I can't find this, and throw a white page, and your site would be broken. If you were to copy some configuration from a different site, try to import it in your site, that's a case where this could happen. Now, as the name of this thing suggests, it will validate that the plugin exists before trying to import it. So it will, in theory, throw an error before you try to import invalid configuration. I say in theory because the part where that validation happens isn't in Drupal yet at the point this got committed, but at least we got somewhat closer. Okay, so we got a new schema data type as well. And I see that someone is messaging me. I should have put do not disturb on. Okay, so there's a new schema data type called lang code. This defines language codes, which in Drupal are usually 2 letters, like EN for English, or DE for German, or NL for Dutch, or lolspeak for lolspeak, which is a language that actually exists in Drupal. It has translations. You can enable it on your site. You can automatically update translations for it. It's a thing. So it could also be some kind of custom language that you define on your site. So we now are allowing this data type to be there, and that it also has an automatic validation constraint that checks that it's a language that is installed on your site. So you cannot import configuration for a language that doesn't exist. There's a new validation constraint added in Drupal 10.2 as well called choice. And choice is actually one that we're going to use a lot in a lot of different kind of situations, because this either gives you a list like of possible options. For example, it can mirror a drop down somewhere where you could only define a couple of selections. Nodes previews are one example. It can be 0, 1, or 2. So that's a choice of those 3 things. It means no preview allowed, preview required, or preview optional. Yes, exactly. Those 3 options. It also is possible to provide a callback here, which is how we are doing the language code stuff. Because that callback can execute PHP code, which makes our dream of having something validated outside of Drupal really difficult, because now we're actually doing database calls and stuff like this. Okay, there's another new schema data type called required label, which is a label that is required. I mean, I'm not sure how to tell you much more about it than this, but it is what it is. But it's quite useful because not all labels are required. And if you were to make a label required in a config schema, you would otherwise have to add a constraint and make it required. And now you can just use a different data type. So it makes it a little bit shorter. So this is it looks like really simple. You say something is fully validatable. But what does that mean? What does it mean to make something fully validatable? Well, for configuration management purposes, it's critical to know which keys are required and which keys can be omitted from a particular part of a schema, which gets quite difficult because sometimes keys can be added optionally based on the setting of something else. And in other words, it can be marked as fully validatable only when the keys that exist in the config are keys that are only allowed now and not optional, and also they are required. It used to be really implicit and really difficult to explain, like how a config schema looked before this. Now it's still really difficult to explain how it works, but at least it's no longer implicit. At least we can tell, like, this is fully validatable, and every key that exists in the config implementation for this particular config schema is there for a reason, and that reason is known by the code. So in general, it used to be that most keys were implicitly required, with the exception of third-party settings and the subkeys of dependencies. Now it is more strict if you add this fully validatable. So I'm gonna shift a bit to something in Form API, which is really closely related to it, because there is now a hash config target in config form base, which allows you for simple config, so only configuration, not config entities basically. Drupal's config system is split up into two parts, one part being simple config, which is all kinds of settings, and the other part being config entities, which is things like views that you create and that you can export. So there's a config target now that you can put on a form. If you define this, you can say in user.settings, find the verify email key and make sure that every single configured constraint on it also is valid when I submit this form. So this allows you to remove all validate form calls from your config forms and remove all the submit form calls as well, because it will automatically save it. So that makes all your config forms easier and shorter, and if you implement it correctly, it also sets you up for success when we do JSON API kind of stuff. So we added config validation to some config entities as well. We made labels stricter. This is the name of the change record. But what this means is a label, for example, a node type, you could have multiple lines in that single label. And that doesn't make any sense, but not because nothing in Drupal is prepared for it to have multiple lines. But it was still a valid thing to do. Now it's no longer the case. Multiple lines are disallowed, and control characters are also disallowed since Drupal 11. There's another new config schema type called bytes, which allows you to store bytes in a way that Drupal understands. There's a new entity bundle exists validation constraint, which validates that an entity bundle exists. There's a plugin exist validator that we talked about earlier. Since Drupal 11, it's now adopted in relevant places, which is everywhere in Drupal core that we could find it, that it would make sense to add, but maybe we didn't find everything, but hopefully we did. That's basically what this change record says. Validation constraints have been added to startup settings. So all of these things are now strictly validatable. So if you're looking for examples, all of those already have validation constraints or didn't have any properties, so they were allowed to be checked as well. Validation constraint was also added to core.dateformat.star, which are the date format config entities. Editor config, which when you think about the fact that Wim Leers has been doing a lot of things about the configuration validation stuff, and he's also the maintainer of editor, the fact that we're only now getting to editor makes gives you some information of how complex getting this issue fixed was. Especially because it's very dynamic and some properties are are only there when two other properties are allowed to be checked and stuff like this. So if you're looking for a more difficult example, this is one that you can look at. There's So we changed the config exists constraints to allow a prefix to be added, because previously a plugin just had to exist, but you could add like a filter format plugin in a place where a view was supposed to be expected, and Drupal would still just blow up. Vocabularies are now validatable through the API, enabling experience builder stuff more. Config that gets imported is now validated before it's imported. So that works for both recipes and for your standard config that comes with a module install. Config validation was added for weights. This is a really tricky one, because a weight of a thing that's in a list, like how do you ensure in a programmatic way that it's something that makes sense? You could say it has to be at most the maximum size of my list, but that makes it really difficult because your validation constraint moves every single time you add a new value to it. Or if you remove one, then you would have to update all of the values, because otherwise your validation constraint no longer passes. So this is a really difficult one. We ended up settling on it has to be no higher than PHP max int, which is the maximum size of an integer on your site, on your particular PHP configuration. Like, this is technically correct, and it's better than having it do a buffer overflow, but it's not the best that we could do, but the best we could think of. There's a Drupal CI job that tests config validatability so we don't regress. This was added like 6 to 7 months after we started doing all the things, and we noticed things regressing, so we added the CI job to help us. This is currently disabled because it's not completely bug-free. Config schema types for field types that have no settings are fully validatable, because there's no way to make them configurable, so that was an easy win. And type resolver is a thing that, so you, in a config schema definition, you can make some things variable or depend on other things by using %parent or %key to refer to, for example, this part of my config schema is only valuable when another checkbox is set. So these kind of things are optionally validatable or optionally configured in your config schema. And this type resolver resolve expression used to not be strict in what kind of % thing it would. You could write %parent or %parents, and it would try to do something with %parents and break because it wouldn't exist and wouldn't know what to do with it. So we've made it better. Here on Drupal.org, it said, note the absence of a useful error, making for a very painful developer experience. And it used to be quite painful, and now is a little bit less so. Sites can now be installed from configuration without a profile, removing the need for a minimal profile for things that don't really need even minimal. Which is a thing that allows a site to be installed from a recipe from a complete blank slate. Line code used to be a property on every single piece of simple configuration, even when it had no translatable values, which doesn't make any sense, because if nothing about this is translatable, or nothing about this can differ per language code, then why does it have a language code? So we've cleaned that up. We've added validation constraint to user.role and system.action and language.entity and search.page and language content.settings. And eventually even recipes got added to core, which is a thing that also uses all of this. So what about this is happening now? Well, in the sprint room here, there's not much going on right now, I'm assuming, but later today there might be things happening. So a thing that Wim said about 7 months ago is that half of Drupal's standard installation profile of simple config for it was already validatable. This is April 15th of this year. So to make that visible, we wrote a script that does a git checkout for every single day that there's a commit on Drupal core, runs a Drush site install, runs a Drush script to check the validatability of every single config that's in that site, then turns all of that into a big bunch of data that's written to a CSV file, uses R and ggplot to transform it into this graph, and this shows us like where we are at today and what happened to make this more visible. So this is how it currently looks today. As you can see, we started in January of 2023, and we're at the last data point here is January of 2025, which is not there yet, obviously. But you can see that when we add the fully validatable constraint, we got a big bump in a couple of things, and when we added some kind of other thing, that we had a bit of a drop in the partially validatable used types part of this graph. But the relative progress is the dark blue line here, and we're at about 42% of all of the things that exist in core being fully validatable or being strictly validatable. So progress. Things that are worked on today or as we want to work on them are, we want to untie more config validation from form validation to ensure that our experience builder use case really works. And we want to add validation to every single config schema out there in core and in most things that end up being in Drupal CMS, hopefully as well, which is another bunch of things that we have to check, and to all the config entity types. And eventually, JSON API post and patch support for fully validatable config entities, which is actually the use case that enables Experience Builder to do things. So if you want to do any of those things yourself, you first have to define your types, make sure that they are correct. There's core.datatypes, core.datatypes.schema.yaml, which is a file where all the schema types are configured from Drupal core. If you look at that file, then there's a lot of information of how it should look, so that really helps. You should add constraints to all the things. Basically, just look through Drupal core on the YAML files with constraints : and then you will find all of the constraints that are currently out there. Add config targets to all your forms for your simple configuration, and you're done. You could use config inspector, which has a really helpful flag to inspect what's still to do or how it's validatable today, and that helps you get ready for those things. You can ask in the recipes channel or use the combination of these two tags on Drupal.org to find issues, and then you should be good to go to help us make this better for Drupal. Are there any questions? No, you can't create constraints through Drush, but they are validated when you do a Drush config import. So that part works, but creating a constraint is two files. You need to have a constraint and a constraint validator. It's a Symfony thing that we just used completely, so it's actually documented quite well both on the Symfony side and on our side. So that should be quite. There should be enough documentation to help you get started with this, and adding the constraints to specific data types is just doing constraints : and then listing the constraints and their configuration in your config schema files. Sure.
modules that are using this because they are Drupal CMS.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which contrib modules are already using this?
Which contrib modules are already using this?
Can you look up examples?
Facets has some. I think that's in Drupal CMS, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think Search API has some, but not all. And I haven't looked at any of the other modules, but those are ones that I happen to be somewhat involved with. So those are ones that I know of. You could look at all the modules that Wim Leers maintains. Those are all validatable as well. Yeah, all of his contrib stuff as well. So for example, the CDN module has good examples in code also. Okay, is that sufficient? I mean, there's no filter on Drupal.org to make it pop up easier than this.
I want to make sure if I understand you right. If I write a custom module, I have my own configuration in it, and I have maybe one option field with 2 options and one text field. And only if I choose a second option, I must enter something in the text field. I can add a constraint in my config definition, where with a PHP call you said, and I can make it. Can I connect these 2 config options and then add my config target in my configuration form, and then everything, the magic works in the background to check?
Yes and no. You can't do this through a constraint. I was actually trying to look this up like right now, but I don't think I will find the code quite quickly. But there's, you have to make a change in your config schema, and that config schema should allow you to define which field depends on another field. And this part can be done completely, is not a validation constraint, it's just a part of a configuration schema type. So that one should be that was already possible before this all started being done. And if it works by using the config target, I think so, but I'm not 100% sure. If it doesn't, then it's a good one to create an issue for on Drupal.org to help us make that happen. Okay. I'll have a look at the code later, and I'll let you know how that actually works. If there are no other questions, then I think we can go grab lunch. Thank you for listening.